Hey guys, we're back with chapter 3 of the Caro-Kann Games course. This is the Panov attack, and our first game is Rostgard against Grandelius. So we see Caro-Kann, Panov with c4, and I kind of wanted to just stop briefly here since it's the first game of the chapter on a6. What do you think about this a6 move?
I think, well, I mean, I was just thinking about how it reflecting on sort of the Panov as a whole, and I think that it's like the most different from all of the other Caro-Kann lines. We have really similar structures in a lot of them, but this one, it's the only one we're fianchettoing. It's like we don't have a pawn on e6 or c6, and it just feels very, very different. And I think this a6 move is kind of nice because it's it raises eyebrows because it's not a super well-known move. And I do tend to gain just a little bit of time on the clock after a6 when they try to figure out like, what's this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of theory in these lines, and there's a lot of like forced draw type lines in the Panov too, and I think a6 kind of avoids all of that, right? Like your opponent's probably out of book after a6, and they're not going to have like a 17 move forced draw. And I think, going back to your point about being different from the other chapters, one similarity we have in this chapter to the other chapters is that we focus on the weakest pawn. And in this chapter, it's all about the d4 pawn. So we're going to try to make that our goal, focus on the d pawn.
That makes sense. Yeah, you're absolutely right to say that.
So let's kind of fast forward this game a little bit till we get to the end of our Caro-Kann repertoire, which I think is right around here. So king f1 for white. We take on b3. Queen takes back, rook d8. Knight takes d5. And at this point, we should probably stop and just talk a little bit about the imbalances. So what does white have here versus black?
Well, White's got a lead in development, and it's a little bit easier for them to see how they're going to get most of their pieces into the game. Like their bishop's coming in nicely. We need a couple moves to do that. Their rook's coming in nicely. The only thing they really got to worry about is the rook on h1, trying to figure out what they're going to do about that guy. And they also kind of have some niggling pressure on the b7 square. In fact, I'm not entirely sure why they would have just taken it. I mean, this wasn't played in the game, but it seems like a pretty logical move to me. And maybe they're afraid. Maybe they saw some of the earlier games in this course where the queen got down deep in the queen side and their own king was a little unsafe. Maybe that's why, but it's not clear to me.
You know what I'm thinking, and this is based on the ratings of the players. So white's rated
Mhm.
2370, black is 2650.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if white was thinking, I'm playing for the draw here. And knight takes d5. You look at this line after the queens trade off, it's very close to equal, but black is the only side that really has any play in the position, right? So, like, if you and I are playing this game against someone near our ratings, we're probably not going for this as white because we want to still play for the win. I'm thinking maybe white was content with the draw. But let's look at this queen takes b7 line. Knight takes c3, b takes, queen c4 check, kind of attacking that king, which doesn't have anywhere to hide.
Hmm.
Black wins the pawn back. And now after h4, e6, it's pretty much heading towards a draw because we can't avoid this perpetual, right? Queen c6 check and queen c8 back and forth.
Yeah, not if you want to take the rook. And if you don't take the rook, then uh, not sure what you're going to do. But
Yeah.
yeah, you can't take the rook if you want to play for a win here. So
So e6, bishop b2, queen back to c8. We can get this queen trade similar to the game in terms of the pawn structure with the queens up, but it's a better version for white. White's getting quicker development, I think.
yeah, I think so too. And it's not clear how we're going to put any pressure against the d4 pawn really at all. And in fact, maybe white will even just play d5 and liquidate, and then they're going to play against our isolated pawn instead.
Yeah, I think one question people may have is can black play rook c2? But with this nice move, rook h3, it can actually swing over to b3. Now the rook is active and defending the b2 bishop. Looks pretty good for white if we go for this line.
Yeah, it's certainly not worse.
So let's look at knight takes d5 played in the game. Queen takes, rook takes. And we do mention in the notes it's very similar to the line we just looked at, except the b pawns are on the board.
Yeah, which limits the bishop. And now, so he converts his bishop into a tall pawn.
Yes. So the bishop is the same color as all these pawns. It's trapped. And actually, this kind of reminds me of that game you just showed me, JD, to reach 2100 in Blitz. Same color bishops. And in this case, there is the pawn sitting here as a target on d4.
Yeah, I think the main difference there was is that I was up a pawn and I was able to take all the rooks off. So, which I think, well, that's a good question. If Black could, if he could just wave a wand and remove all the rooks from the board, does that decrease or increase the winning chances?
I really think it depends on the activity of the rooks. Um, so I would like to keep the rooks on for as long as possible until I felt pretty confident that it's increasing the winning chances. And the reason I say that is because when white has the weakest pawn on the board, I want the flexibility to move those rooks around. Like maybe I go to the king side, go to the queen side, and try to get the white rooks passive. Like if they're both sitting on the d file, guarding the d pawn, and our rooks have options, that's really what we want. And then maybe at some point we can like trade rooks to win a pawn or to get something closer to conversion.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to win this, you probably have to keep the rooks on because I'm just envisioning a situation where like the white king just sets right here and maybe just plays passively and puts the pawns on dark squares, and then just can shuffle with his bishop or king. And it's not. I don't know how we're ever going to do anything in that kind of a setup.
I agree with you. Yeah, there's not enough weaknesses if it's just the pawn on d4.
Oops, I didn't mean to play rook c2. That would be a strange move. I guess it's not a losing move, but it's kind of strange.
It's okay. So king e2 played by white, bishop to d6, rook d1, pawn to h5. I like these kind of moves. So, kind of like we just talked about, the pawn on d4 is likely not enough for black to play for the win.
Mhm.
When you play a move like h5, h4, h3, it starts to get your opponent thinking, and you provoke a small weakness over there, and it gains this extra space that our rooks can kind of work behind the pawns.
Yeah, if we can fix, so if we're allowed to play h3, then we're just one small sacrifice away from a pass pawn on h2. That happens a lot in these end games where you end up sacrificing, say, on b3, and in a situation where they're forced to take back with the h pawn, and then you're queening really quickly. So, and if as in a game, I'm drawing too many arrows here, the pawn, we end up with this h3 versus h4. Well, now this g2 pawn is fixed and
Mhm.
it can never move, and perhaps we'll do a better job of being able to attack it later.
I think this really kind of shows like the grandmaster talent, right? Like, how does a 2600 outplay a 2300? 2300 is a very strong player in a position that's close to equal. And I think this is like a masterclass endgame by Grandelius. After h3 was played, h4, and then rook to c3 by white. And now Grandelius plays rook to b5, poking at the b2 pawn, rook c2. And now we see rook to g8. What's the idea with this move?
I think again, just the idea is he at least wants white to think about that he's going to play g5 g4, and then maybe we can capture on g on h3, and we're going to have this idea that he's stuck maybe kind of defending d4, and we'll be able to more easily shift over and attack the h3 pawn later in the game and just have two targets that we can try to bounce back and forth between and hope that white can't handle both of them.
Yeah, so can we create the second weakness? I think that's the big question in this endgame. If we can, very good winning chances for black. So at this point, there's a small mistake by black. Um, I'm sorry, there wasn't a mistake. So he played f6, and we do look at g5 and mention that it's just a little too early for this move because after f3, f5, rook d to c3, white's actually getting a little bit of counterplay coming over here on the queen side. Let's say g4 is played. We have f takes g, f takes, bishop f2. It just doesn't quite feel like there's enough, right? Like everything's trading off king side, and white's rooks are sitting nicely on the queen side.
Yeah, and they're getting their own pressure against our h4 pawn rather than us getting pressure against h3. And we have liquidated quite a lot, and perhaps too much. We'd like to keep some pawns on the board.
So f6 was played in the game, and I think that's a good decision. Just slow playing this a little bit, not committing too much to the g5 idea. a4. Now, this is kind of a cool move. Rook to c8. Rook to d5 is another nice option, and that seems very natural. I like this rook to c8. It looks strange at first, but the idea is we can take this rook with check, and if they take us, we can take the b2 pawn with check. So it's like white can't really take. Uh, so then he actually plays king to d1 in the game, a bit passive, and I think this is where black starts to kind of turn up the heat in the position.
Yeah, because I mean this pawn move a4, it's not a defended pawn, and it's perhaps not super easy to defend. So he just swings over and attacks it. But then b3, and the white pawns are kind of starting to inch forward, and that's not always the best thing because those pawns, the further forward they come, the easier it's going to be for us to try to put some pressure on them.
That's a really good point. And like you've mentioned in a previous game, the pawns can never move backwards. So very committal to put those pawns up there. And I think what white's trying to do is put their pawns on light squares, which often makes sense with the dark square bishop. But it does still create these dark holes, right? That maybe black can infiltrate later on.
Yeah,
Okay, this idea I really like. Rook h5. You look at that rook on a5, how is it getting back into the game? Maybe this is what white was thinking too. Oh, that rook is stuck. There's really no play for black. But look at this move. Rook to h5, swinging it around through the eighth rank.
yeah, I thought this was really nice and instructive way because we have two lateral ranks, and so we were playing on the fifth one, but there's a lot of pawns and bishops that are kind of taking some of those squares away from us. So let's go. We'd like to get back to the C file, and this is the only route back.
So white plays rook c2, rook c3, trying to control it. You see rook h8, king d3, and now b5 by black. So we're still like the engine is saying this is pretty much equal, but I think, psychologically, this has to be throwing white off a little bit. Like he's just being posed with question after question, and it's not easy to figure out, do I take the pawn? Do I let black take me? You're really trying not to make a mistake here. And I think A takes B gives black, some of those winning chances back again because all of a sudden now we have this new open file for black to utilize.
Yeah, it is nice because we couldn't come to the C file because, as we talked about earlier, we're not really wanting to trade rooks. I mean, because white already has the king on that D3 square we were talking about, and we do have a pawn that is fixed on a dark square. So I don't think we want to trade rooks at all. We definitely want to keep those rooks on the board.
Yeah, I agree with you. White plays rook to C1. Now we see rook to A8, and all of a sudden there's two threats. Rook A3, rook A2. This is another tough question for white. How do you defend against both of those threats? The G2 pawn is potentially weak. That's why it's highlighted over there. Um, See, I think here I would probably even make a mistake as white. Rook C2 is the strongest move, but to me, it's not that intuitive of a move. Like, how do you know where to put the rook here?
Yeah, you might think that, oh, I'm not that worried about him coming to A2 because I'll just play rook C2 then. Uh, but it's not easy. Although it's hard to think that too many moves would lose.
Well, let's say like rook to D1, just as an example. This king could
But
start to come up already to D5.
yeah, I was
You
just
know,
noticing as soon as you came off, the king would like to advance. It's not super easy to see how the king is going to advance.
yeah. So we see rook to C2 by white, rook to A3. Nice move, poking at this pawn. King to C3. Now rook to A1. So it does feel like they're kind of just spending a little time jacking for position here. White offers a rook trade. This is a mistake according to Stockfish. Um, the problem is after the rook goes to a2, rook c2, there's this really cool in-between move, bishop to b4 check. And after king to d3, black finally got what they wanted, what he wanted, and it's to bring the king up without that rook on c2 being able to slow it down, right? So now finally black is getting all the pieces on active positions, and there's, like we talked about, a second weakness. There's two weaknesses now, and maybe even a third on g2 if black is able to swing the rook over.
Certainly, and it's tough now because now the the white rook has to go super passive now with rook to b2, which is not a square that the rook wants to be on. It's not clear that he's lost yet, but he's now having to make moves that don't feel good.
And here, king to d6 is the strongest move. But black plays rook to a1. So wasting a little bit of time potentially. It's more straightforward to just march the king up. Let's see what happens though. King to e4, f5 check, king to f4. And I think the idea here is these pawns on light squares will work well with the dark square bishop. Now we see a
Yeah,
bishop to c3. What a move.
it is nice kicking the rook away, and I think the idea is that, I mean, we're just gonna play rook to b2 and win the pawn that way. Or
Yeah.
sorry, rook to b1, and after the rook moves.
So the crazy thing is like after f5 check, the only good move here is king back to d3. But who's going to find that? When white's trying to get their king up to the center to challenge the black king, it's really hard to make a move like that where you move backwards. But king to d3 is really the only move here, I think, that can hold you close to a draw. This was
King to
a
e5 is a good way to end the game immediately if you're tired of playing.
I like that one. Bishop d6 check. Would
Yeah,
have been a nice finish.
yeah.
We see bishop c3, rook c2, pawn to b4, and this white king is now just out of play, and the b3 pawn is going to die. So bishop to d2 is played, takes, and now black marches the king up, prevents king to e5 by white. And now we see a mistake again by white, pawn to d5, take, rook to b1. And here it just becomes a bit more, I don't know if technical is the right word, but it's just can black prove that he is able to convert this winning position.
And I think now is a good point to like, because we're going to force the rook to d3, and h5 or h5 h4 that we played earlier starts to kind of come into play, because the pawn on the g pawn's much less mobile. So when we get to the second rank, it's not easy for white to like. He would love to move those pawns up to meet his king and empty the second rank so that our rook is not so strong there. But because of our pawn holding them back, that's harder to achieve.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So that H pawn is doing a good job now on the king side. Rook d3, straightforward rook to b2 is probably a little bit stronger. King c5 was played though. King f4, and now we see rook to b2. The king goes back to a passive position, and this is like the number one tip I have for players in rook and pawn endgames. You always need to have activity. Black is not up any material here, right? We're dead even on material, but it's the activity in the past d pawn that's winning for black.
Yeah, I think instead White should have just, instead of coming back to defend like earlier, a few moves earlier, they maybe should have just went all in and tried to, uh, I mean, yeah, bring the king over this way, or maybe at some point they had an opportunity to try to go to the queen side or the king side and try to create their own counterplay. But that's tough because our pawn's already on b4 and it's going to be really fast.
Yeah, so I think it's just too little, too late for white. Like you have to commit early on because once you reach this point, you really can't play active anymore. You're just stuck to a passive endgame. So king f3, pawn to d4. See some trades on g3, king to d5, and now look at this plan highlighted. Rook c2, rook c3, in just a couple moves, this game is over. I'll show you the ending. H4, rook c2, king f4, rook c3, rook f3, pawn to d3. And here white resigns. So 52 move game. It was a long grind, and a lot of it was close to equal, but it was always just slightly on black's side in terms of eval.
Yeah, we're just pressing and just like it's like, I heard this analogy recently of chess game being kind of like tennis, where like you don't always have like some master plan. You just got to keep hitting the ball over the net, and just say that it's their job. They got to keep doing the same, and sometimes they miss the ball, and that's I think what happened here. Black just kept hitting the ball over the net, and eventually White failed to hit the ball back.
Yeah, and to continue the tennis analogy, I'm not like a tennis pro, but I feel like it's white's playing on the baseline or something where black has a little more options maybe on where they place the ball, and you just keep posing question after question and trying to make them defend.
You obviously know more about tennis than I do because I'm not even sure how what your analogy means.
Oh, okay. But I think the key point is right here. H5 and that just idea of create that second weakness. So play active, create that second weakness. Those are the 2 points I would say to keep in mind for this game. Uh,
And then when he opened the A file or the second file to play on his rook to avoid the rook trade, so that he could um, when he played B5 and then we had the capture there, and he was either going to open the B file or the A file was going to get open, and we needed a second file to play on for our rook.
yeah, really good point. So that this actually did become the second weakness, didn't it? On B3. All right, so that's game number 1 of chapter 3. This is an exciting chapter. There's a lot of fire in this chapter. Just this game 1, a little bit drawish, but I think it's nice to see the endgame technique too and how to outplay someone 2370 FIDE.